Imagine a house. From the outside, the house looks strong. The walls are tall. The roof is solid. The flag flies above the door. But inside, the foundation is cracked. The crack runs deep through the floor, through the walls, through every room. And the people who live in this house know the crack is there. They have known for a long time. Many leaders chose to delay it. Many others fought to expose it. But the nation never fully repaired it. This is the story of the United States before the Civil War, a nation that promised freedom but built part of its wealth on slavery, a nation that called itself united but was deeply, dangerously divided. The American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865. It was fought between the northern states, known as the Union, and the southern states, which formed a separate government called the Confederacy. By the time the war ended, an estimated 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers had died. It remains the deadliest conflict in American history. But this war did not begin with cannons. It began with a question the country refused to answer honestly. Can a nation that promises freedom also allow slavery? Today, we will follow that question from the first cracks in the foundation to the war that nearly destroyed the house and to the difficult, unfinished work of rebuilding it. Let's begin. Chapter 1. A House Already Cracking. The United States declared its independence in 1776. The Declaration of Independence stated that all men are created equal. But at the time those words were written, roughly 500,000 people were held in slavery across the American colonies. This was a contradiction, a situation where two ideas directly conflict with each other. The country spoke about freedom, but its economy, especially in the southern states, depended on the forced labor of enslaved people. By the early 1800s, the divide had become geographic. The northern states had largely moved away from slavery. Their economy was built more on factories, trade, and paid labor. The southern states, however, relied heavily on cotton. And cotton was picked by enslaved men, women, and children. By 1860, roughly 4 million people were enslaved in the South. Slavery was not just an economic system. It was a system of control. Enslaved people had almost no legal protection. They could be sold, separated from their families, and punished without meaningful legal protection. And yet, enslaved people resisted through escape, through secret education, through preserving their communities, and through the courage it took simply to survive. The country tried to manage the divide through political compromise. Leaders in Congress made agreements about which new territories would allow slavery and which would not. But these compromises never solved the deeper moral problem. They only delayed it. Then, in 1857, the United States Supreme Court made a ruling that deepened the wound. In a case known as Dred Scott v. Sandford, the court declared that black people, whether free or enslaved, were not citizens of the United States. The court ruled that they had no right to bring a case to court at all. This was not just a legal ruling. A ruling is a formal decision made by a court of law. And this particular ruling told millions of people that the law did not see them as human beings with rights. 1 year later, in 1858, a politician from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln gave a speech that used a powerful image. He said that a house divided against itself cannot stand. He warned that the nation could not continue to exist half slave and half free. It would eventually become all one thing, or all the other. Lincoln was not yet president, but his words described the country's deepest truth. The crack in the foundation was growing. and no compromise could hold it together forever. The house was already cracking. But soon, politics would make the crack wider. Chapter 2. When compromise began to die. For decades, American leaders had used compromise to keep the peace between the North and the South. Compromise means finding a middle solution when two sides disagree, but a compromise only works when both sides are willing to accept it and when the problem at the center can actually be divided. Slavery could not be divided. A person is either enslaved or free. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This law allowed people in new territories to vote on whether to allow slavery. The idea was called popular sovereignty, letting the people decide. But in practice, it created chaos. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas, each side hoping to control the vote. The result was violence. Armed groups attacked each other. Towns were burned. People were killed. The territory became known as Bleeding Kansas, a place where a political argument turned into armed conflict. This was a warning. When a deep moral problem is not solved, debate can turn violent. People stop listening. They take sides. Fear spreads. Then, in 1859, an abolitionist named John Brown led a raid on a federal weapons storage at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. An abolitionist is a person who fought to end slavery completely. Brown believed that armed rebellion was the only way to destroy slavery. His raid failed. He was captured, put on trial, and executed. But Brown's raid sent shockwaves through the country. In the North, some people admired his anti-slavery commitment, while others were alarmed by his violence. In the South, many saw the raid as proof that the North wanted to destroy their way of life by force. Fear grew on both sides. And fear, in a divided nation, is a dangerous thing. It closes ears. It sharpens anger. It makes people believe that the other side is an enemy, not a neighbor. The compromises that had held the country together for decades were failing. The argument over slavery had moved from Congress to the courts, from the courts to the territories, and from the territories to armed conflict. The country was not yet at war, but it was moving closer with every passing year. Then came the election that turned division into separation. Chapter 3. The nation breaks apart. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. Lincoln ran as a candidate of the Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. He did not win a single Southern state. In fact, in many Southern states, his name did not even appear on the ballot. For the South, Lincoln's election was a breaking point. They believed that a president who opposed slavery's expansion would eventually threaten slavery itself, and with it, the entire economic and social system of the Southern states. Within weeks of the election, South Carolina became the first state to secede. Secession means formally leaving a political union. By February 1861, 6 more Southern states had followed. Together, they formed a new government, the Confederate States of America. It is important to understand what the Confederacy was defending. Confederate leaders stated clearly, in their own declarations, that the preservation of slavery was central to their cause. The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, declared publicly that the new government was founded upon the idea that black people were not equal to white people. This was not a hidden belief. It was a stated principle. When people today say the Civil War was only about states' rights, it is important to ask, the right to do what? The primary right that the Confederacy fought to protect was the right to own enslaved human beings. By April 1861, the tension reached a critical point. A Union military Fort Sumter sat in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, now part of the Confederacy. Confederate forces demanded its surrender. The Union refused. On April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter. The attack lasted roughly 33 hours. No soldiers were killed during the bombardment itself, but the symbolic meaning was enormous. The first shots of the Civil War had been fired. And those shots were not aimed at a foreign enemy. Americans were firing at Americans. The nation had broken apart. The divided house was now at war with itself. But soon, the meaning of the war would change. Chapter 4. The war changes its meaning. When the war began, President Lincoln's stated goal was to preserve the Union, to bring the country back together. The war was not officially about ending slavery. Many people in the North supported the Union, but did not necessarily support abolition. But the war forced the question of slavery into the center. As Union armies moved into Southern territory, thousands of enslaved people escaped and crossed into Union lines. They were seeking freedom, not waiting for it to be given. Their actions created a practical crisis and a moral one. These men, women, and children were making a choice with their feet. They were choosing freedom, and they were forcing the Union to decide what that meant. Military leaders had to decide. Would they return escaped people to slavery, or would they protect them? Slowly, the answer changed. Enslaved people who reached Union forces began to be classified as contraband of war, property seized from the enemy. The language was imperfect, but the direction was clear. Then, on January 1, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation means being set free from slavery. A proclamation is a formal public announcement. This document declared enslaved people in areas still in rebellion to be free. The proclamation did not immediately free everyone. It applied only to areas still in rebellion, not to border states that had stayed in the Union. But it transformed the war. From that moment, the Union war effort officially included liberation, and for the first time, black men were officially allowed to serve as soldiers. Roughly 180,000 black men served in the Union Army by the end of the war. They fought in major battles. They faced greater dangers. Confederate forces sometimes refused to treat captured black soldiers as prisoners of war. They fought knowing this. They fought anyway. Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man who became one of America's most powerful speakers and writers, pushed Lincoln and the nation to recognize that black soldiers were fighting for their own freedom, not receiving it as a gift. Harriet Tubman, who had escaped slavery years earlier and led dozens of people to freedom through the Underground Railroad, served the Union Army as a scout, a spy, and helped lead a military raid. Freedom was not only promised from above, it was demanded, claimed, and fought for from below. In July 1863, the war reached one of its deadliest moments at the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. Over 3 days, an estimated 50,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing. Months later, Lincoln delivered a short speech at the Gettysburg Battlefield Cemetery. He spoke of a new birth of freedom and asked whether a nation dedicated to the idea that all people are created equal could survive. The war had changed its meaning. It was no longer only about preserving the Union. It was about what kind of nation the Union would be. But even when the Union moved closer to victory, the question remained: what happens after the fighting stops? Chapter 5. Victory without peace. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Its armies were exhausted. Its cities were damaged. Its economy, built on enslaved labor, was falling apart. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at a place called Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The meeting took place in a quiet room, in a private home. Lee signed the terms of surrender. The war was effectively over, but victory did not feel like celebration. The country was scarred. An estimated 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers had died. Entire communities had been destroyed. Families had been torn apart, sometimes literally divided, with brothers fighting on opposite sides. Then, just 5 days after the surrender, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He was shot while attending a theater in Washington, D.C. He died the following morning, on April 15, 1865. The nation, already exhausted by war, now faced the loss of the leader who had guided it through the conflict. Lincoln's death left a deep wound and a difficult question: who would lead the healing? The period after the war is called Reconstruction. It was an attempt to rebuild the nation and to define the rights of formerly enslaved people. During this time, 3 important amendments were added to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery throughout the United States. An amendment is a formal change to the Constitution, the highest law in the country. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, declared that all people born in the United States were citizens and were entitled to equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, stated that the right to vote could not be denied based on race. These amendments were historic. They changed the legal foundation of the country. But law alone could not repair everything. During Reconstruction, formerly enslaved people built schools, formed churches, started businesses, ran for political office, and began building new lives. Black men were elected to state legislatures and even to Congress. For a brief period, there was real progress toward equality. But that progress was met with violent resistance. White supremacist groups used terror to suppress black political power. Over time, Southern states passed laws designed to strip away the rights that the amendments had promised. These laws created a system of racial segregation and discrimination that would last for nearly another century. The war ended slavery by law. But it did not finish the struggle for equality. A divided house can survive only when it tells the truth about why it was divided. The American Civil War forced that truth into the open, but telling the truth was only the beginning. The house survived, but it was not fully repaired. Final reflection. The American Civil War is not a simple story of good against evil, or of victory and celebration. It is a story about what happens when a nation refuses to face its deepest moral failure and what it costs to finally confront it. Slavery was at the center of this conflict. Not taxes, not trade, not abstract political theory. The Civil War was fought because one part of the country demanded the right to enslave human beings, and another part of the country slowly, imperfectly, and often reluctantly, moved to stop it. The people who fought for freedom were not only presidents and generals. They were enslaved men and women who escaped. They were black soldiers who enlisted knowing the dangers. They were abolitionists who spoke when speaking was dangerous. They were ordinary people who chose, in small and large ways, to push the country toward its own stated promise. The war ended. The house survived. But healing takes more than survival. It takes honesty, sustained effort, and the willingness to keep building even when the work is slow. That work, in many ways, continues still.